The divorce papers trembled in Rebecca Morrison's hands as she sat in the marble lobby of Morrison and Associates, unaware that the keys in her late grandmother's safety deposit box, delivered by a courier just 20 minutes earlier, had made her the sole owner of a trillion-dollar real estate empire spanning 47 countries. Her husband of 12 years, James Morrison, stood 15 feet away with his secretary-turned-fiancée, Christina Vale, their matching smirks widening as Rebecca's tears fell onto the legal documents that would dissolve their marriage by sunset. But what none of them knew was that the empire Rebecca had just inherited included the very building where James worked, the penthouse where Christina dreamed of living, and the chain of luxury hotels where James had conducted his year-long affair. Christina's designer heels clicked against the polished floor as she approached Rebecca with a condescending smile, ready to mock the woman she'd labeled as the pathetic wife who couldn't keep her man. But she had no idea that her cruel words would trigger a transformation that would not only shock James to his core, but would also set in motion a series of events that would dismantle everything he'd built on lies. The question wasn't whether Rebecca would sign those papers. It was what she would do in the 60 seconds after Christina's mocking laughter echoed through the lobby, and whether James would recognize the dangerous calm in his wife's eyes as the moment his entire world began to crumble. Would Rebecca reveal her newfound power immediately, or would she let them continue their victory dance while she planned something far more devastating? Would James understand what he'd lost when the truth finally surfaced, or would his arrogance blind him until it was too late? And what would Christina do when she realized that mocking Rebecca Morrison was the single biggest mistake of her entire life? The morning had started like any other Tuesday, but Rebecca Morrison didn't know that by noon, her entire existence would split into a before and after that would redefine everything she thought she understood about power, betrayal, and the invisible chains that had bound her for over a decade. She'd woken at 6, prepared James's coffee exactly how he liked it, 2 sugars, a splash of cream, served at precisely 185 degrees, and watched him scroll through his phone with the detached interest of a man who'd stopped seeing his wife years ago. But she'd smiled anyway because that's what she'd trained herself to do. The coffee mug had still been warm in her hands when the doorbell rang at 8:45. A courier in a gray uniform holding a manila envelope with her name written in her grandmother's distinctive calligraphy, but James had already left for the office without saying goodbye. Rebecca had signed for the package, her fingers tracing the familiar handwriting of Eleanor Ashworth, the grandmother who'd raised her after her parents died in a car crash when she was 7, but who had passed away 3 months ago in her sleep at the age of 94. Inside the envelope was a single key, a handwritten letter, and the business card of an attorney named Howard Chen at Ashworth Legal Group. But Rebecca had only read the first line, "My dearest Rebecca, you are stronger than you know," before her phone buzzed with a text from James. "Meet me at my office at 11. Important. Bring your ID." She should have known something was wrong, but 12 years of marriage had taught her to ignore the warning signs that her instincts screamed, to rationalize his coldness as stress, his late nights as ambition, his emotional distance as the natural evolution of long-term relationships. The taxi ride to Morrison and Associates had taken 23 minutes, but Rebecca had spent those minutes staring at the key in her palm, wondering what locked box or storage unit her grandmother had left behind, wondering if it contained photo albums or jewelry or perhaps the old recipe books Eleanor had always promised to pass down. The building that housed Morrison and Associates was a sleek 40-story tower in downtown Manhattan, all glass and steel and the kind of modern architecture that looked expensive but felt cold. But Rebecca had visited only 3 times in 12 years because James preferred to keep his work life separate. The marble lobby gleamed under recessed lighting, the reception desk staffed by a blonde woman whose smile never reached her eyes, but Rebecca had barely noticed, because standing near the elevator bank was James, and beside him was Christina Vale. Rebecca had met Christina twice before, once at the company holiday party where Christina had spilled red wine on Rebecca's dress and laughed it off as an accident, and once at a charity auction where Christina had loudly compared Rebecca's homemade dessert to something from a grocery store clearance bin. But she'd never seen them standing together like this, their body language telling a story that words wouldn't need to confirm. James wore his navy suit, the one Rebecca had bought him for their 10th anniversary, but Christina's hand rested on his forearm with the casual ownership of someone who'd touched him in far more intimate ways. "Rebecca," James said, his voice carrying across the lobby with the formal tone he used with clients he didn't particularly like, but his eyes didn't meet hers. "Let's get this over with." The courier had arrived 16 minutes earlier, but Rebecca hadn't opened the second envelope he'd handed her, the one from Ashworth Legal Group with urgent, time-sensitive documents stamped in red across the front, but it sat in her purse like a ticking clock. She'd been too focused on James's text, too worried about what important might mean, too conditioned to prioritize his needs over her own curiosity. But now, as she walked toward him and Christina, her heels clicking on the marble in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown, she felt the weight of that unopened envelope like a secret trying to surface. "What's this about?" Rebecca asked, but James handed her a folder without ceremony. Inside were divorce papers, already signed by him, needing only her signature to become final. But the date at the top showed he'd filed them 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of coming home, of eating dinners she'd prepared, of sleeping in the same bed, all while these papers existed in some lawyer's office waiting, but he'd said nothing. "I think it's self-explanatory," James said, but Christina stepped forward, her red lips curving into a smile that carried the cruelty of someone who'd won a competition Rebecca hadn't known she was in. "It's nothing personal, Rebecca," Christina said, her voice dripping with false sympathy that was more insulting than open hostility, but her eyes sparkled with genuine pleasure. "James and I are in love. Real love. The kind you probably don't understand because, well, look at you." Rebecca did look at herself then, saw her reflection in the polished elevator doors, her simple blue dress from 3 seasons ago, her minimal makeup, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her entire appearance radiating the kind of invisible exhaustion that came from making yourself smaller for years. But she also saw something else in her eyes that she hadn't seen in a long time, a flicker of something that might have been anger, or might have been the first spark of awakening. "Christina's moving into the penthouse with me," James continued, but his voice had taken on the rehearsed quality of someone who'd practiced this speech, someone who needed to justify himself even though he clearly felt entitled to everything he was taking. "We're getting married in December. My lawyer will handle the asset division, but you'll be fine. The apartment on 5th Street is yours, and I'll give you enough to get back on your feet." The apartment on 5th Street was a 1-bedroom in a neighborhood that had been gentrifying for a decade but still wasn't quite there, a place James had insisted she move into when they'd first married because it was practical and financially smart, but he'd moved into his downtown penthouse 2 years ago for work convenience. Getting back on her feet implied she'd fallen, but Rebecca had been standing all along, just in a position he'd chosen for her, but she realized now that he'd been positioning her for this exit all along. "Sign them," Christina said, but her voice had shifted from fake sympathy to barely concealed impatience. "Unless you want to drag this out and look even more pathetic than you already do." The word pathetic hung in the air between them like a challenge, but Rebecca felt something click in her mind. A door opening to a room she'd kept locked for 12 years. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Rebecca, you are stronger than you know." But she'd read that line an hour ago, and now it felt less like a platitude and more like a prophecy. "You know what's funny?" Christina continued, but she stepped closer, close enough that Rebecca could smell her expensive perfume, close enough that her voice dropped to a cruel whisper that James could still hear. "I've been sleeping in your bed, using your towels, eating meals you cooked for over a year. Every time you texted him, 'I love you,' he was with me. Every time you called to ask when he'd be home, we were laughing about it. You were just so easy to fool, so trusting, so pathetic." The marble floor seemed to tilt under Rebecca's feet, but she didn't fall, didn't cry, didn't react the way Christina clearly wanted her to, but something in her chest was expanding, pushing against the walls of the small, controlled space she'd been living in. The envelope from Ashworth Legal Group seemed to burn in her purse, but she still hadn't opened it, still didn't know what her grandmother had left her. But in that moment, she decided something that would change everything. She wouldn't sign the papers here, and she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "I need to make a call," Rebecca said, but her voice was calm, steady, carrying a tone she didn't recognize as her own. "Are you serious right now?" James snapped, but his composure cracked slightly, revealing the irritation of someone who'd expected submission and received resistance. "Just sign the damn papers, Rebecca. Stop being difficult." "One call," Rebecca repeated, but she was already walking toward the corner of the lobby, pulling out her phone, dialing the number on Howard Chen's business card. He answered on the second ring, but his voice was professional, clipped. "Ashworth Legal Group, Howard Chen speaking." "This is Rebecca Morrison," she said, but her hands were shaking as she opened the envelope from his office, scanning the first page of dense legal text. "My grandmother was Eleanor Ashworth. I received a key and your card this morning, but I haven't had time to—" "Ms. Morrison," Howard interrupted, but his voice shifted to something urgent, almost excited. "I've been trying to reach you all morning. Have you opened the documents I couriered to your home?" "I'm opening them now," Rebecca said, but her eyes caught on phrases that didn't make sense. "Sole beneficiary, real estate holdings, an estimated valuation of 1.3 trillion, 47 countries, immediate transfer of ownership." The lobby around her seemed to fade, but she could still see James and Christina watching her, their expressions shifting from impatience to confusion, but she focused on the words swimming before her eyes. Trillion, not million, trillion. With a T, 47 countries, hotels, commercial properties, residential buildings, land holdings that stretched across continents, but the name at the top of the portfolio was Ashworth Global Holdings, a company she'd never heard of, but apparently her grandmother had built it from a single property purchase in 1952 into an empire that owned everything, from the hotel where Christina probably booked rooms for her affair with James to the building where they were standing right now. "Ms. Morrison, are you still there?" Howard's voice pulled her back, but the world had shifted on its axis. "I'm looking at the documents," Rebecca said, but her voice sounded distant even to herself. This says I own Morrison and Associates building." "You own the building, yes, but you also own the holding company that James Morrison's firm leases from, which means you're technically his landlord, but there's more," Howard said, but he was speaking faster now, as if he understood the urgency of her situation. "Your grandmother kept her business dealings extremely private. She built her empire under her maiden name, Ashworth, and never connected it publicly to your family name. She wanted you to inherit everything when she passed, but she also wanted you to choose when and how to reveal your ownership. The key you received opens her private office in the Ashworth building on Lexington Avenue. Everything you need to take control is there." Rebecca's mind raced through memories she'd suppressed, but they surfaced now with new clarity. Her grandmother's monthly book club meetings that lasted for hours, her frequent volunteer work at various organizations that Rebecca now realized were probably property management meetings, her insistence that Rebecca get a business degree, even though James had later convinced her to abandon her career plans to support his dreams. But Eleanor had never pushed back on that decision, had only said cryptically, "You'll know when it's time to use what you've learned." "Ms. Morrison, I need to know," Howard said, but his voice carried a weight of professional responsibility. "Do you want to take possession of your inheritance today? Because once you sign the transfer documents and I file them with the appropriate authorities, you'll have complete control over one of the largest private real estate empires in the world. Your grandmother wanted you to have power, but she also wanted you to be ready for what that power would bring." Rebecca turned to look at James and Christina, but they were still watching her, James checking his watch with exaggerated impatience, Christina examining her manicure with the bored superiority of someone who thought the outcome was already decided. But neither of them knew that the woman they were dismissing was currently holding documents that made her richer than both of them could comprehend. The divorce papers sat on the marble reception desk where she'd left them, unsigned, but they represented a version of her life that was ending anyway, just not in the way James thought. "I want to take possession," Rebecca said, but her voice was steel now, the voice of Eleanor Ashworth's granddaughter, the voice of a woman who'd been invisible for too long. "What do I need to do?" "I need you to come to the Ashworth building within the next hour," Howard said, but she could hear him typing, presumably arranging the meeting. "Bring your ID and the key. I'll have the documents ready for your signature. Once you sign, you'll have immediate access to all accounts, all properties, all holdings. You'll also have access to your grandmother's private letters to you, explaining everything she built and why she kept it secret for so long." Rebecca ended the call, but she stood in the corner of the lobby for another 30 seconds, breathing deeply, processing the earthquake that had just reshaped her entire world, but also planning what came next. She could walk over to James and Christina right now, could tell them everything, could watch their faces as they realized what she'd just inherited, but something held her back, not fear, but strategy, the kind of strategic thinking she'd suppressed for years, but that now flooded back with the force of instinct, awakened. She walked back to where they waited, but her posture had changed, her shoulders back, her chin lifted, her entire energy shifted from apologetic to something they couldn't quite identify, but it made James frown. "Are you done with your drama?" Christina asked, but her attempt at condescension fell flat against Rebecca's new calm. "I'm not signing today," Rebecca said, but she picked up the divorce papers, folding them carefully and placing them in her purse next to the Ashworth documents. "I need time to review them with my own lawyer." "Your own lawyer?" James laughed, but it was a harsh sound, devoid of humor. "Rebecca, you don't even have a job. Who's going to pay for a lawyer? Just sign the papers and stop wasting everyone's time." "I said I need time," Rebecca repeated, but she was already walking toward the elevator, toward the exit, toward the new life that was waiting for her, 15 blocks away at the Ashworth building. "You can't just walk away," Christina called after her, but her voice had risen to a shrill pitch that echoed through the lobby, drawing attention from other people, other witnesses to this moment. "You're nothing without him. You have nothing. Sign the papers or he'll make sure you get nothing in the settlement." Rebecca stopped at the lobby doors, but she didn't turn around, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her face, didn't reveal what she now knew that they didn't. But she said quietly, just loud enough for them to hear, "We'll see about that." The taxi ride to the Ashworth building took 14 minutes, but Rebecca spent every second of it reading through the documents Howard had sent, her mind cataloging properties and holdings and financial statements that rewrote her understanding of her grandmother's life. Eleanor Ashworth had been 52 when Rebecca's mother was born, had been 70 when Rebecca came to live with her after the accident, but she'd never stopped working, never stopped building, never stopped preparing for the moment when she could pass everything to her granddaughter. But she'd also never told Rebecca any of it, had let her believe that the comfortable brownstone where they'd lived had been her only asset. Why? The question burned in Rebecca's mind, but she knew she'd find answers in the private letters Howard mentioned. The Ashworth building was a dignified pre-war structure on Lexington Avenue, elegant but understated, the kind of building that old money preferred because it didn't need to announce its worth. But the lobby directory showed 60 floors of offices for various companies, none of them obviously connected to Ashworth Global Holdings. Howard Chen met her at the private elevator bank at the back of the lobby, his expression serious but his handshake warm. "Ms. Morrison," he said, but he gestured to the elevator. "Your grandmother's office is on the 60th floor. No one has entered it since her passing except for my assistant, who prepared the documents you'll need to sign." The elevator ride felt both endless and too quick, but Rebecca watched the floor numbers climb, each one bringing her closer to a truth that would change everything, but also further from the woman she'd been just 3 hours ago. The doors opened directly into an office that took up the entire 60th floor, but it wasn't the size that made Rebecca's breath catch. It was the walls covered in photographs, photos of buildings, properties, landmarks she recognized from around the world, but each one labeled with a small brass plaque. Paris, Hotel Lumière, acquired 1967. Tokyo, Sakura Towers, acquired 1981. Manhattan, Morrison Building, acquired 1993. But that last one made Rebecca stop, made her do the math, because James hadn't started his firm until 2008, which meant her grandmother had owned the building 15 years before James had ever set foot in it. "She was very proud of you," Howard said, but he stood beside a massive mahogany desk where documents were arranged in neat stacks. "She kept track of everything, your degree, your volunteer work, your marriage. She wanted to tell you about all of this, but she also wanted you to find your own strength first. She told me once that giving you power before you understood your own worth would have been like handing a weapon to someone who didn't know how to use it. She wanted you to be ready." "But I wasn't ready," Rebecca said, but tears were forming now, not from sadness, but from a complex mix of grief and anger and gratitude. "I spent 12 years making myself smaller, letting James control everything, believing that was what love looked like. If she'd told me I could have—" "You could have what?" Howard interrupted gently, but his voice carried the wisdom of someone who'd spent years working with Eleanor Ashworth. "Left him immediately. He would have assumed you were leaving because of money, and you'd never know what you were truly capable of. Your grandmother believed that you needed to see who James really was, to feel the pain of his betrayal, to reach the breaking point where you'd have to choose yourself, not because of money, but because of self-worth. She believed that only then would you be truly ready to wield the power she'd built for you." Rebecca thought about Christina's mocking words, about James's casual cruelty, about the year of lies they'd maintained, while she'd made coffee and dinners and plans for a future that had never existed. But she also thought about the moment in the lobby when she'd felt something shift inside her, when she'd chosen not to sign the papers, not because she knew about the inheritance, but because she'd finally recognized her own value, separate from him, separate from anyone's definition but her own. "She was testing me," Rebecca said, but it wasn't an accusation, just a realization. "She was preparing you," Howard corrected, but he gestured to the documents. "These need your signature. Once signed, you'll have complete control of Ashworth Global Holdings. You'll also have access to her private accounts, which contain approximately $47 billion in liquid assets. separate from the property holdings. She's left detailed instructions for how to manage everything, but she's also made it clear that all decisions are yours to make. You can sell it all, keep it all, or do anything in between. You're not bound by her wishes except for one. She asks that you wait 90 days before making any major decisions, to give yourself time to learn the business and understand what you truly want. Rebecca signed the documents, but each signature felt like shedding a layer of the person she'd been forced to become, revealing someone stronger underneath, someone who'd always existed but had been buried under years of trying to be what James wanted, what society expected, what she'd mistakenly believed was her only option. The last document was titled Private Letters from Eleanor Ashworth to Rebecca Morrison, but Howard handed her a key. "The letters are in the cabinet behind the desk," he said, but he checked his watch. "I'll give you privacy to read them. When you're ready, press the intercom button and my assistant will bring you everything else you need. Account access codes, property deeds, contact information for your executive team. Yes, you have an executive team. Your grandmother employed a full staff to run operations. They've been waiting for you." When Howard left, Rebecca sat in her grandmother's chair, her chair now, and opened the cabinet, but inside were 50 letters, each dated from the past 12 years, one for each month since Rebecca had married James, but they were sealed, waiting. She opened the first one, dated from August 2013, 1 month after her wedding. "My dearest Rebecca, by now you're married to James and I hope you're happy, though I suspect you're not. I saw how he looked at you at the wedding, not with love, but with satisfaction, like someone who'd acquired a useful asset. I've built my empire over 70 years by learning to read people, and I can read him. You might wonder why I didn't stop the wedding, why I didn't tell you what I saw. The truth is that some lessons can't be taught. They must be learned. You need to discover for yourself what real partnership looks like, what respect feels like, what love actually means when it's genuine and not just words. You need to feel the absence of those things so deeply that when you finally leave, and I believe you will, it will be a choice you make from strength, not fear. I'm building something for you, my darling, an empire that will give you freedom, security, and most importantly, power. But power in the wrong hands, or in the hands of someone who doesn't understand their own worth, becomes a prison. So I'm watching, and I'm waiting, and I'm preparing everything for the moment when you're ready. When that moment comes, and you'll know it when it does, look for my letters. I'll have left you guidance for everything you need to know. With all my love." Grandmother Rebecca read through letter after letter, but each one chronicled Eleanor's observations of her marriage, her concerns, her hopes, her ongoing acquisition of properties and assets, specifically chosen to give Rebecca control over the people and places that had controlled her. The Morrison building had been acquired deliberately after Eleanor learned it was where James worked, but she'd hidden her ownership through layers of holding companies. The penthouse James lived in, owned by an Ashworth subsidiary, his lease coming up for renewal in 3 months, but the renewal clause included a provision that the owner could terminate with 90 days' notice for personal use of the property. The final letter was dated 3 weeks before Eleanor's death. "My dearest Rebecca, if you're reading this, I'm gone and I hope you're not too sad. I've lived a full life, built something meaningful, and most importantly, I've had the privilege of watching you grow into the woman I always knew you could be. By now, you probably know what I've given you, but I want you to understand why I kept it secret for so long. Money and power don't change who we are, they reveal who we've always been. I needed you to discover your own strength before I handed you the tools to use it. I needed you to learn that your worth isn't tied to James, to any man, to anyone's opinion of you. I needed you to reach the point where you'd choose yourself even if you had nothing, because only then would you be ready to handle everything. James will likely leave you. Men like him always do when they find someone who requires less and offers more ego gratification. When he does, you'll face a choice. Let him define your ending or write your own story. I'm betting on you to write your own story. The empire I've built is now yours, but it's not a gift. It's a responsibility. Use it wisely. Use it to help others who feel trapped like you did. Use it to prove that women don't need permission to be powerful. And use it to live the life you deserve, not the life someone else decided you should have. You are stronger than you know, Rebecca. You always have been. Now go show the world. With eternal love, Grandmother Rebecca folded the letter carefully, but tears streamed down her face. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming love of a woman who'd seen her struggling and had quietly, strategically, prepared a lifeboat while teaching her how to swim. The clock on the desk showed 3:47 p.m., but Rebecca pressed the intercom button. Howard's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia, entered with a rolling cart containing binders, tablets, and files, but she also carried a confident smile. Ms. Morrison, I've been helping manage your grandmother's operations for 15 years, and I'm at your service. Where would you like to start? I want to know everything about the Morrison building, Rebecca said, but her mind was already calculating, planning, preparing for what came next. Specifically, I want to know about James Morrison's lease, his firm's financial situation, and every single property that either he or Christina Vale currently occupies. Patricia's smile widened, but she opened a tablet, scrolling through information with practiced efficiency. Morrison and Associates has a 5-year lease that expires in 93 days. Their current rent is $87,000 per month, but the market rate for that space has increased to approximately $156,000 per month. They've been operating on the old rate because the lease was negotiated before the area developed. As for renewal, you have the right to refuse or to offer renewal at market rate. And James's penthouse? Rebecca asked, but she already suspected the answer. The penthouse at the skyline is owned by Ashworth Holdings. James Morrison has been renting it for 2 years at $15,000 per month, significantly below market value of $32,000. But again, this was negotiated under a special rate program your grandmother created before she knew he was your husband. Once she found out, she maintained the low rate deliberately. The lease includes a 90-day termination clause that can be invoked by the owner at any time. Rebecca thought about Christina moving into that penthouse, about James's smug confidence in offering Rebecca enough to get back on her feet, about the casual cruelty of people who'd never imagined consequences, but she also thought about her grandmother's final letter. Use it wisely. I want to invoke the termination clause on the penthouse, Rebecca said, but she paused, thinking. But I want it done through proper legal channels. Send the notice today. James has 90 days to vacate. As for Morrison and Associates, I want to offer them a lease renewal at market rate, with one additional condition. The firm must agree to a full financial audit to ensure they're in compliance with all building regulations and zoning laws. Patricia nodded, but she was already making notes. The audit will likely reveal several violations. Most tenants in that building have minor issues, but your grandmother had files suggesting Morrison and Associates has been using residential zoned space for commercial purposes without proper permits. Perfect, Rebecca said, but the word felt powerful in her mouth. I also want to know every hotel, restaurant, venue, or property that Christina Vale has used in the past year. Credit card records, social media check-ins, anything you can find legally. That's easy, Patricia said, but she pulled up a file that was already prepared, as if she'd anticipated this request. Ms. Vale has a preferred hotel she uses for her Instagram posts, the Grandview Hotel. She posts there approximately twice a week. She also frequents Luminu Restaurant for business lunches and is a member at the East Side Club. All 3 properties are owned by Ashworth Holdings. Rebecca felt a smile forming, but it wasn't cruel. It was strategic, calculated, the smile of someone who'd learned that power wasn't about revenge, but about boundaries, consequences, and ensuring that people who operated without empathy learned what accountability felt like. I want Christina Vale's memberships revoked at all our properties, Rebecca said, but she kept her voice measured. I want it done quietly, without explanation, just a simple membership terminated notice, and I want the hotels informed that she's no longer welcome to book rooms. If she asks why, they're to tell her it's a corporate decision. Done, Patricia said, but she continued typing. Shall we discuss the other properties? You own 17 of the 20 hotels in Manhattan, where high-profile affairs are typically conducted. If James tries to continue seeing Christina or starts seeing anyone else, he'll likely encounter issues booking rooms. No, Rebecca said, but she shook her head. I don't want to control his personal life. I just want him to understand that his actions have consequences, and that the world he's been navigating so comfortably is built on systems he never questioned because they served him. Let him figure out on his own why things are becoming difficult. Over the next 3 hours, Rebecca learned the full scope of her inheritance, but it was overwhelming in a way that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. She owned properties that shaped cities, that employed thousands of people, that generated enough revenue to fund small countries, but she also owned the responsibility of managing all of it ethically, of being the kind of leader her grandmother had been, powerful but principled, strategic but not cruel. At 7 p.m., her phone buzzed with a text from James. Where are you? We need to finalize the divorce today. Christina and I have plans. Rebecca stared at the message, but she thought about the man who'd sent it, the man who'd betrayed her for a year, who'd served her divorce papers in his office lobby like a business transaction, who'd stood by while his mistress mocked her, who'd assumed she'd sign away their marriage without question because he'd never considered that she might have options, power, or worth beyond what he'd assigned her. She typed back, I've retained my own lawyer. You'll hear from them next week. Enjoy your plans. His response came immediately. Are you serious? You can't afford a lawyer. Stop being ridiculous. But Rebecca didn't respond because she'd already turned her attention to the binder Patricia had labeled Strategic Options, which outlined various approaches to handling business relationships with people who'd treated her poorly, but each option was careful, legal, and designed to create consequences without cruelty. Her grandmother had been right. Power revealed character, but it didn't have to corrupt it. That night, Rebecca stayed in her grandmother's office, her office, reading through files and making plans. But she also spent an hour looking at the photographs on the walls, seeing her grandmother's life work displayed in brass plaques and property acquisitions, but also seeing the careful strategy of a woman who'd built an empire while preparing her granddaughter to inherit it. Every acquisition had been purposeful, every decision calculated to give Rebecca not just wealth, but freedom, not just power, but choices. At midnight, she finally called Howard Chen, who answered despite the late hour. Ms. Morrison, how are you holding up? I'm overwhelmed, Rebecca admitted, but her voice was steady. But I'm also clear about what I want to do. I want to honor my grandmother's legacy, but I also want to build something of my own. Can you set up a meeting with the executive team for tomorrow? I want to learn the business, understand our operations, and start making decisions about how I want to lead. Of course, Howard said, but she could hear the approval in his voice. Your grandmother would be proud. She always said you'd rise to this when the time came. There's one more thing, Rebecca said, but she pulled up the divorce papers on her tablet. James filed for divorce 3 weeks ago, but there's a 60-day waiting period before it can be finalized. I want to file a response that contests the asset division. He's claiming that everything we built during the marriage should be split 60-40 in his favor because he was the primary earner. But I want to claim 50% of everything he has, and I want to make it clear that I'm prepared to fight for a fair settlement. That's reasonable, Howard said, but he paused. Though I should mention that once he learns about your inheritance, his lawyers will likely argue that you don't need financial support. The prenuptial agreement you signed limits your claims to marital assets acquired during the marriage. I know, Rebecca said, but she'd already read through the prenup James had insisted she sign before the wedding, the one that protected his $200,000 in savings and his future earnings. But here's what the prenup doesn't account for. I put my career on hold to support his. I managed his home, hosted his clients, built the social connections that helped him succeed. The prenup values his time and money but treats mine as worthless. I want that challenged, not because I need his money, I don't, but because I want him to understand that my contribution had value even if he never recognized it. The next morning, Rebecca returned to her apartment, the small one-bedroom on 5th Street that James had called practical. But she saw it differently now. It wasn't a compromise or a limitation. It was a choice she'd made when she didn't know she had other options. But now she did, and she could choose to keep it, sell it, or fill it with furniture that actually reflected her taste, rather than James's minimalist preferences. She changed into a black suit she'd bought for job interviews she'd never attended because James had convinced her his career should come first. But it fit perfectly, and when she looked in the mirror, she saw her grandmother looking back, determined, capable, ready. The meeting with the executive team lasted 4 hours, but Rebecca asked questions, took notes, and made it clear that she wasn't a figurehead who'd rubber stamp their decisions. She was a leader who intended to learn the business, understand every aspect of operations, and eventually make informed choices about the company's future direction. They respected that. Some of them had worked with Eleanor for decades, and they'd been worried that her granddaughter would sell everything or install inexperienced managers. But Rebecca's approach earned their cautious approval. That evening she received a call from an unknown number, but when she answered, a woman's voice said, "Is this Rebecca Morrison? This is calling from the Grandview Hotel. We've been instructed to inform Christina Vale that her preferred suite is no longer available for booking, but she's insisting that there's been a mistake and that she needs to speak with ownership. She's mentioned your name. We're unsure how to proceed." Rebecca smiled, but it was the smile of someone who'd learned that consequences didn't always require confrontation. Sometimes they arrived quietly through policy changes and business decisions that seemed impersonal but weren't. "Tell Ms. Vale that there's no mistake. Our booking policies have changed, and we're no longer able to accommodate her reservation requests. If she has concerns, she can contact our corporate office, but the decision is final." "Understood," the woman said, but Rebecca could hear the satisfaction in her voice, as if the hotel staff had been waiting for this moment. 2 days later, James called her 17 times, but Rebecca answered none of them. He texted, "We need to talk now." Then, "My lawyer says you're contesting the divorce. This is insane." Then, "Christina says you're behind her being banned from her hotel. Did you really stoop that low?" Rebecca finally responded, "I'm not behind anything. I've retained counsel for the divorce proceedings. All communication should go through them. As for Christina's hotel situation, I have no idea what you're talking about, but perhaps you should consider that actions have consequences." His response was immediate. "What is that supposed to mean?" But Rebecca didn't answer because she was sitting in her office at the Ashworth building, reviewing the financial audit preliminary results for Morrison and Associates, and the findings were damning. James's firm had been operating in violation of zoning laws for 2 years, using residential zone space as office space, without proper permits, which put the entire building at risk for fines. The audit also revealed that his firm was 3 months behind on rent, despite his personal spending on the penthouse and expensive dinners that Rebecca could now see itemized in the building's records. "Ms. Morrison," Patricia said, but she entered with another file. "The audit is complete. Morrison and Associates owes approximately $261,000 in back rent and permit violations. Your grandmother had been allowing them to slide because she didn't want to cause problems for you. But now that you're in charge, you have the right to demand immediate payment or to terminate their lease." Rebecca thought about her grandmother's letter. "Use it wisely. Use it to help others who feel trapped like you did. Use it to prove that women don't need permission to be powerful." "Send James Morrison a formal notice," Rebecca said, but she kept her voice measured. "He has 30 days to pay the back rent and bring his firm into compliance with all zoning laws, or his lease will be terminated. Make it clear that this is a business decision based on the audit findings, not a personal matter. If he wants to discuss it, he can schedule a meeting with our property management team, not with me personally." "Shall I mention that you're the owner?" Patricia asked, but her expression suggested she already knew the answer. "No," Rebecca said. "Not yet. Let him think he's dealing with standard building management. He'll figure it out eventually. But I want him to experience what it feels like to be on the other side of power, to be the one who has to comply, to justify, to scramble for solutions. He'll learn more that way than if I simply revealed everything and let him try to manipulate me directly." The 30-day notice was delivered to James's office on a Thursday afternoon, but Rebecca heard about his reaction through Patricia, who'd heard from the building manager. James had shouted at the messenger, demanded to speak with whoever's in charge, and threatened legal action for harassment and targeting. The building manager had calmly explained that the audit had revealed violations that put the entire building at risk, that multiple tenants were being asked to come into compliance, and that this was purely a matter of business operations, not personal vendetta. "He doesn't believe it's not personal," Patricia reported, but she seemed amused. "He's convinced you're somehow behind this, but he can't figure out how you'd have that kind of influence. He actually said, 'My wife doesn't know anyone with that kind of power,' to the building manager." "He's right that I didn't know anyone," Rebecca said quietly, but she looked at the photograph of her grandmother on the desk. "But I inherited someone's power, and that's even better." The 90-day notice for James to vacate the penthouse arrived a week later, but by then Christina had already posted on social media about being mysteriously banned from her favorite hotel and restaurant, which had attracted attention from her followers. Some suggested she'd been rude to staff. Others speculated about unpaid bills. A few conspiracy theorists claimed she'd offended someone powerful, but no one suspected the truth, that the invisible woman she'd mocked in a lobby 3 weeks ago now controlled the very spaces where Christina had performed her carefully curated lifestyle. James finally figured it out when his lawyer called to inform him that the owner of both his office building and his penthouse was listed as Ashworth Global Holdings, and that a Rebecca Morrison had recently been registered as the CEO and primary shareholder. But even then, it took him another day to connect the dots, to realize that his wife, his soon-to-be ex-wife, had somehow acquired ownership of properties worth billions of dollars. He showed up at the Ashworth building unannounced, but security stopped him at the lobby, calling up to Rebecca's office for approval, but she told them to send him away. He came back the next day and the day after that. each time more desperate, more confused, more angry. But Rebecca refused to see him because she'd learned from her grandmother that power didn't require explanations or justifications to people who'd never offered her either. On the 31st day after the compliance notice, James still hadn't paid the back rent or fixed the violations, but his lawyer sent a letter requesting a meeting with building ownership to discuss the situation and reach an amicable solution. Rebecca agreed to the meeting but brought Howard Chen and Patricia, while James arrived with his lawyer and, surprisingly, Christina. The conference room was on the 35th floor of the Ashworth building, neutral territory that Rebecca had chosen deliberately, but when James walked in and saw her sitting at the head of the table, his face went through several emotions: confusion, recognition, shock, and finally anger. "Rebecca," he said, but his voice cracked slightly. "What are you doing here?" "I own the building," Rebecca said simply, but she gestured to the chairs across from her. "Please sit down. We have several business matters to discuss." Christina's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide her shock, but she looked at James as if expecting him to explain, to make sense of this impossible situation, but he had no answers. They sat, but the power dynamic had shifted so completely that the room itself seemed to tilt. "I don't understand," James said, but his lawyer placed a restraining hand on his arm, sensing that anything he said might make things worse. "It's quite simple," Howard said, but he opened a file. "Rebecca Morrison is the sole owner and CEO of Ashworth Global Holdings, which owns this building, your office building, your current penthouse residence, and approximately 1,147 other properties worldwide. She inherited this empire from her grandmother, Eleanor Ashworth, 3 weeks ago, but she's chosen to maintain the confidentiality of her ownership until recently." The silence that followed was profound, but Rebecca watched James's face as the implications settled in. Every aspect of his life that he'd thought was secure, every space where he'd felt powerful, every privilege he'd taken for granted, was actually built on property she now controlled. "3 weeks ago," Christina repeated, but her voice was barely a whisper. "That was the day you mocked me in the Morrison building lobby," Rebecca finished, but her tone was calm, factual. "The day you told me I was pathetic, that you'd been sleeping in my bed, using my towels, laughing at my texts. Yes, I'd just found out about the inheritance about an hour before that meeting, but I hadn't fully understood what it meant yet. Thank you, actually. Your cruelty helped me understand exactly what I needed to do." Christina looked like she might be sick, but James leaned forward, his expression shifting to something calculating. "Rebecca, look, I know things ended badly between us, but we were married for 12 years. Surely we can work something out. You have to admit, this is quite a coincidence. Me working in your building, living in your property. Maybe it's a sign that we should reconsider the divorce. We could be a powerful team." Rebecca had wondered if he'd try this, if his pride would allow him to attempt to manipulate his way back into her life now that she had money, but hearing it still made something cold settle in her chest. "Let me be clear," Rebecca said, but she met his eyes directly. "I'm offering you a lease renewal at market rate for your office space, conditional on immediate payment of back rent and compliance with all zoning regulations. I'm also giving you 60 days instead of 90 to vacate the penthouse because I've decided to renovate it. These are business decisions, not personal ones. As for the divorce, it will proceed as planned. Your lawyer has my counter-proposal regarding asset division." "This is insane," Christina said, but she'd found her voice again, though it shook. "You can't just kick us out because you're bitter about the divorce. That's discrimination." "It's not discrimination to enforce lease terms and zoning compliance," Howard said calmly, but he slid documents across the table. These are the audit findings. Morrison and Associates has been operating in violation of building codes for 2 years. These are the accumulated fines. And this is the termination clause in the penthouse lease, which allows the owner to reclaim the property for personal use with 60 days' notice. Everything is legal and above board. How much is the market rate lease? James's lawyer asked, but he'd been reading through the documents with increasing concern. $156,000 per month, Patricia said, but she'd prepared a comparison sheet showing similar spaces in the area. This is actually below average for comparable office space in this location, given recent developments. James went pale, but Rebecca saw him calculating whether his firm could afford that rate, whether he could somehow maintain his lifestyle and his business while also losing the penthouse, whether there was any angle he could play to change her mind. But she'd learned from her grandmother that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for someone was to let them experience the consequences of their choices without softening the blow. "I'll need time to consider the offer," James said stiffly, but his pride was visibly wounded. "You have 48 hours, Rebecca said, but she stood, indicating the meeting was over. "After that, the lease offer expires and we'll seek a new tenant. As for the penthouse, that decision is final. You'll receive official notice by courier tomorrow." As they left, Christina turned back at the door, but her earlier confidence had completely evaporated. "I don't understand. You were nobody. You had nothing. How did you—" "I was always somebody," Rebecca said quietly, but not unkindly. "I just didn't know it yet. My grandmother spent 70 years building this empire, and she left it to me not because I deserved it, based on anything I'd done, but because she believed I would deserve it, based on what I would do. The difference between us, Christina, is that you measured my worth by what I had, who I was married to, what I could offer you. But my grandmother taught me that worth isn't given, it's inherent. You didn't see it in me, and honestly, I didn't see it in myself for a long time. But now I do." After they left, Rebecca sat alone in the conference room, but she felt an unexpected emotion, not triumph, not satisfaction, but a deep, settling peace. The revenge she'd imagined in her angrier moments hadn't materialized because she'd realized she didn't need it. Watching them understand their miscalculation was consequence enough. Howard lingered at the door, but his expression was thoughtful. "Your grandmother would be very proud of how you handled that. You didn't gloat, didn't belittle them, just enforced reasonable boundaries and business standards. That's real power." "I keep thinking about what she wrote," Rebecca said, but she pulled up her grandmother's letter on her tablet. "Use it to help others who feel trapped like you did." I want to do that. I want to create a foundation that helps women leave bad situations, that provides housing and job training and startup capital for women who need a fresh start. I want to use some of the properties for affordable housing. I want to build something that helps people the way my grandmother helped me, even though she did it through inheritance rather than direct intervention. "She'd love that," Howard said, but he smiled. "And I'll help you set it up. But first, you should know that James's firm declared bankruptcy this morning. He can't afford the market rate lease or the back rent. He's going to lose the business." Rebecca felt a complicated twist of emotions, but ultimately what surfaced was not satisfaction, but sadness. Not for James, but for the person she'd been who had loved him, despite all evidence that he wasn't worthy of that love. What happens now? His lawyer will likely try to negotiate, to ask for leniency or a payment plan, but that's your decision, Howard said. You can offer him terms, or you can let the lease termination stand and find a new tenant. Rebecca thought about her grandmother's words again. Use it wisely. Wisdom wasn't about crushing people who'd wronged you. It was about setting boundaries while still operating with integrity, but it also wasn't about sacrificing yourself to save people from consequences they'd earned. Tell his lawyer I'll offer a 6-month payment plan for the back rent, but he still needs to come into compliance with zoning regulations within 30 days or the lease terminates regardless, Rebecca said finally. And the market rate lease stands. I'm not running a charity for people who treated me badly, but I'm also not going to destroy his business out of spite. He can make his own choices about whether he can afford to stay. Over the next 3 months, Rebecca's life transformed in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with purpose, but the financial resources certainly helped. She moved into her grandmother's brownstone, the house where she'd been raised, which she'd assumed had been sold after Eleanor's death, but which had actually been held in trust waiting for her. And she filled it with art and furniture that reflected her own taste, rather than anyone else's preferences. She hired a full staff to help manage Ashworth Global Holdings, but she also spent hours every day learning the business, visiting properties, meeting with tenants and employees, understanding the empire her grandmother had built. The foundation launched 6 months after she'd inherited the company, but it was designed carefully with input from experts in domestic violence support, job training, and affordable housing. The Eleanor Ashworth Foundation would provide transitional housing, career counseling, startup capital, and legal support for women leaving difficult situations, but it would operate as a hand-up rather than a handout, respecting the dignity and agency of the women it served. James accepted the payment plan but couldn't ultimately afford the market rate lease, and his firm dissolved 8 months after their confrontation in the conference room. But Rebecca heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd taken a position at a larger firm, working for someone else rather than running his own company. Christina had moved to Los Angeles. Her Instagram presence diminished after she'd been banned from the Manhattan properties that had formed the backdrop of her curated lifestyle. But Rebecca felt no pleasure in that, just a vague hope that both of them would eventually learn something from the experience. The divorce was finalized 9 months after James had served her papers in his office lobby. But the settlement was exactly what Rebecca had proposed, a 50-50 split of their actual marital assets, which amounted to about $47,000 each after accounting for debts. James's lawyer had tried to claim part of her inheritance, arguing that some of it should be considered marital property, since Eleanor had died during the marriage, but Howard had efficiently demolished that argument by proving that Eleanor had established the trust before Rebecca's marriage, that Rebecca had never been involved in the business operations, and that the inheritance was clearly designed to be separate from any marital assets. At the final hearing, James had tried one last time to speak to her privately, but Rebecca had declined. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't be painful for him or unsatisfying for her. But she'd learned that closure wasn't something someone else could give you. It was something you created for yourself by choosing to move forward. A year after inheriting the empire, Rebecca stood in her office on the 60th floor of the Ashworth building. But she was looking at a new photograph on the wall. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the first Eleanor Ashworth Foundation housing complex, a renovated building that would house 40 women and their children while they rebuilt their lives. In the photo, Rebecca was smiling, but it was the smile of someone who'd found purpose beyond survival, meaning beyond money, power that served rather than controlled. Her phone buzzed with a message from Patricia. New tenant signed for the Morrison building space. Modern architecture firm, very excited about the location. Paying market rate without negotiation. Thought you'd want to know. Rebecca smiled, but she typed back, "Perfect. Send them a welcome basket and make sure they know about all the building amenities." As she looked out over Manhattan, watching the sunset paint the city in gold and amber, Rebecca thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, the woman who'd trembled with divorce papers in her hands, who'd felt pathetic and powerless, who'd believed her worth was tied to a man who'd never valued her. That woman had been real, her pain valid, her struggle genuine, but she'd also been stronger than she knew, carrying the seed of who she could become, even when she couldn't see it herself. Her grandmother had seen it, though, had known that beneath the layers of learned helplessness and enforced smallness was a woman capable of wielding power with wisdom, grace, and purpose. But she'd also known that Rebecca needed to discover that herself, to feel the full weight of betrayal and dismissal, so that when she finally stood up, it would be from conviction rather than circumstance. The inheritance had given her options, but the choice to use those options with integrity that had come from somewhere else, from the values her grandmother had modeled, from the pain of being underestimated, from the determination to be more than what others assumed she was capable of becoming, but ultimately from the recognition that her worth had never depended on external validation and that true power came not from controlling others but from taking control of her own life. James had served her divorce papers expecting submission, but he'd accidentally liberated her, had removed the final chain that kept her bound to a version of herself that no longer served her. But what shocked him most wasn't that she'd inherited a fortune. It was that she'd handled that fortune with more wisdom and strategic thinking than he'd ever given her credit for possessing. Christina had mocked her for being pathetic, but she'd failed to understand that sometimes the quietest people are simply conserving their strength for the moment when they finally decide to speak. And Rebecca had spoken, not with anger or spite, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her own power and chose to wield it with purpose. But the message was clear. She was no longer the woman they'd dismissed. She'd never returned to the small space they'd tried to confine her to, and the empire she'd inherited was not just a collection of properties and assets, but a platform from which she could help others find the strength she'd discovered in herself. That evening, as she locked her office and headed home to the brownstone filled with memories of her grandmother, Rebecca paused at the photograph wall one last time, but her eyes landed on a small brass plaque she hadn't noticed before, tucked in the corner beneath the photo of the Paris hotel. For Rebecca, may you always remember that you are stronger than you know. Love, grandmother. She'd been reading those words for a year, but they meant something different now, something deeper, because she finally understood what her grandmother had known all along. Strength wasn't about never being hurt or never feeling weak. It was about rising after being knocked down, learning from the pain, using the lessons to build something better, and choosing every day to be more than what others expected. The divorce papers she'd refused to sign in that lobby a year ago were filed away now, finalized but meaningless, except as a reminder of the day everything changed. But not because James left her or because she inherited billions, because she finally saw herself clearly, recognized her worth, and decided that she deserved better than she'd been settling for. And that realization, more than any inheritance, more than any revenge or consequence or corporate triumph, was what truly set her free. 5 years had passed since Rebecca Morrison stood in a marble lobby with divorce papers in her trembling hands, but the woman who now walked through the corridors of the Ashworth building bore only a surface resemblance to that earlier version of herself. Her hair was shorter now, cut into a sleek bob that framed her face with professional confidence, but her eyes held something that couldn't be styled or purchased, the calm certainty of someone who'd been tested and discovered they were stronger than the test. The 60th floor had changed too, but subtly. The photographs her grandmother had hung remained on the walls, though Rebecca had added her own acquisitions beside them, each brass plaque telling a story of growth, expansion, and most importantly, purpose. The Eleanor Ashworth Foundation now operated in 17 cities across 3 countries, but the Manhattan flagship had served over 300 women and their children in the past 5 years, with an 87% success rate in helping them establish independent, stable lives. Patricia knocked on the open door, but she carried a tablet and wore the expression that meant something interesting had developed. "Ms. Morrison, you have a visitor request that I thought you should personally approve or deny." "Who?" Rebecca asked, but she was reviewing the quarterly reports for their affordable housing initiatives, properties that operated at break-even or slight losses but generated the kind of wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars. "James Morrison," Patricia said, but her voice was carefully neutral. "He's in the lobby, says he has something important to discuss, but he won't say what. Security is waiting for your instructions." Rebecca felt a flicker of something, not the pain that would have consumed her 5 years ago, not even curiosity, but rather a detached interest in what could possibly bring him here after all this time. But she also recognized that she had no obligation to satisfy that interest. "Did he schedule an appointment?" "No," Patricia said, but she consulted her tablet. "Though his assistant did call last week asking about your availability for a meeting. We sent the standard response that you schedule meetings through your executive assistant, and that requests should include the purpose and anticipated duration. They never followed up with the required information." Rebecca smiled slightly, but it was the smile of someone who'd learned that boundaries weren't walls to keep people out. They were filters to ensure that only those who respected her time and dignity were granted access to either. "Tell security to inform Mr. Morrison that all meeting requests must go through proper channels. If he submits a formal request with the purpose clearly stated, my office will review it and respond within 3 business days." "Understood," Patricia said, but she paused at the door. "For what it's worth, he looks different. Older, less arrogant," Rebecca supplied, but her tone wasn't cruel, just observant. "I was going to say confident, but yes, that too," Patricia said, but then she left to relay the message. Rebecca returned to her reports, but her mind wandered briefly to James, to what his life might look like now, to whether he'd learned anything from the implosion of his firm and his marriage. But she found that she didn't particularly care about the answers. He'd become a footnote in her story rather than a defining chapter, and that shift, that ability to think of him with indifference rather than pain or anger, was perhaps the clearest measure of how far she'd traveled. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, but when she opened it, the message made her pause. "Rebecca, it's James. I know you probably don't want to talk to me, and I understand why, but I'm not here to ask for anything or to make excuses. I'm here because I owe you an apology, a real one, and I'd like the chance to give it to you in person, not because it will change anything or because I expect forgiveness, but because you deserve to hear it. If you're willing to give me 15 minutes, I'll be waiting in the lobby. If not, I'll leave and never bother you again." Rebecca read the message 3 times, but each reading revealed the same thing. It wasn't a manipulation or an attempt to worm his way back into her life. It was the message of someone who'd been humbled and had learned, finally, that not everything was a negotiation. She thought about her grandmother's letters, about the woman who'd built an empire while teaching that power should be wielded with wisdom, about the foundation named in her honor that helped women like Rebecca had been. But she also thought about what kind of person she wanted to be, not just to strangers who needed help, but to people who'd hurt her. She texted back, "Conference room C, ground floor, 15 minutes, come alone." The elevator ride down felt longer than it was, but Rebecca used the time to center herself, to remember that she was meeting him as an equal, no, as someone who held all the power in this interaction, but who chose to exercise it with grace rather than cruelty. The conference room was small, designed for quick meetings, but it had windows overlooking the street and furniture that was comfortable without being intimate. James was already there. When she arrived, But he stood when she entered, his movements carrying none of the casual entitlement she remembered. He was 42 now, but he looked older, his hairline receding slightly, his face carrying lines that suggested stress or regret, or perhaps both. But his eyes met hers directly, without the deflection she'd grown accustomed to during their marriage. "Thank you for seeing me," he said, but he didn't move to shake her hand or embrace her, respecting the distance she'd established by her posture. "You have 15 minutes, Rebecca said, but she sat across from him, her spine straight, her hands folded on the table. James nodded, but he took a breath before speaking. "I've spent the past 5 years trying to figure out how to say this, how to apologize in a way that doesn't sound like I'm making excuses or asking for something in return. I've started and deleted probably 50 emails. I've rehearsed speeches in my head. But the truth is there's no perfect way to say this, so I'm just going to be honest." He paused, but Rebecca waited silently, giving him nothing to work with except her attention. "I was cruel to you," James continued, but his voice was steady, sincere. "Not just at the end, but throughout our marriage. I took your support for granted, dismissed your dreams as less important than mine, made you feel small because it made me feel big. I justified it by telling myself that I was the breadwinner, that my career was more important, that you were lucky to be with me. And when Christina came along and told me everything I wanted to hear about myself, it was easier to believe her flattery than to face the truth about what I'd become." Rebecca felt something in her chest loosen, but it wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. It was the recognition that he was finally seeing clearly, that the past 5 years had stripped away the delusions that had defined their relationship. "The divorce, the way I handled it, having Christina there to mock you, that was unforgivable," James said, but his hands clenched on the table. "I let her treat you that way because I was too much of a coward to face my own guilt. And when I found out about your inheritance, my first thought wasn't happiness for you or pride in what your grandmother had built. It was anger that you'd somehow won, as if our marriage had been a competition instead of a partnership." "It was never a partnership," Rebecca said quietly, but her voice was firm. "A partnership requires mutual respect, shared decision-making, equal value placed on both people's contributions. What we had was an arrangement where I diminished myself so you could feel more important." "You're right," James said, but he didn't try to argue or defend himself. "And I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every time I made you feel like you weren't enough. I'm sorry for the affair, for the lies, for the cruelty. I'm sorry that it took losing everything, my business, my relationship with Christina, my reputation, for me to understand what I'd thrown away. Not your money, but your loyalty, your kindness, your strength. You were always strong, Rebecca. I just spent 12 years trying to convince you that you weren't." Rebecca studied him, but she was looking for signs of manipulation, for the angle he was playing, for the request that would inevitably follow this apology, but she found none of those things. What she saw was genuine remorse, the kind that came from consequences rather than empty words. But she also saw something else. He'd become smaller somehow, not physically, but energetically, as if the loss of his inflated self-importance had revealed the actual dimensions of his character. "What happened with Christina?" Rebecca asked, but it was curiosity rather than concern. James laughed bitterly, but it was directed at himself. "She left me 3 months after you inherited everything. Turned out she was only interested in the lifestyle I'd promised her, not in the struggling lawyer I became after the firm collapsed. She's married now to some tech executive in California. I hear she's happy." "And you?" Rebecca asked, but she kept her voice neutral. "I'm working at a mid-size firm, making decent money, but nothing like what I had before," James said, but he shrugged. I've been in therapy for 3 years. My therapist has helped me understand that I built my entire identity around external validation, money, status, the admiration of people like Christina, and when all of that disappeared, I had to figure out who I actually was underneath. It wasn't pretty. No, Rebecca said, but there was no cruelty in the agreement. I imagine it wasn't. I'm not here to ask you to forgive me, James said, but he met her eyes directly. I know I don't deserve that, and honestly, I'm not sure I've earned it yet. I'm still working on becoming someone worthy of forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I see now what I couldn't see then. You were never the problem. My insecurity, my need to control you, my inability to recognize your worth, those were my failures, not yours, and I'm sorry that you spent 12 years believing otherwise. Rebecca felt tears forming, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were the tears that came when something you'd been carrying for too long was finally lifted, when someone finally validated the truth you'd known but hadn't been able to articulate, when the gaslighting stopped and reality was acknowledged. Thank you, she said quietly. I needed to hear that. I know it doesn't change anything, James said, but he stood, recognizing that the 15 minutes were almost over. But I hope it gives you some closure. You've built something incredible, Rebecca. The foundation, the way you've managed your grandmother's empire, the lives you've changed. I read about it all, and I'm proud of you. I know I have no right to be proud, but I am anyway. Rebecca stood too, but she extended her hand, a professional gesture that acknowledged what they'd been to each other, while firmly establishing what they were now. Two people who'd shared a past, but had no claim on each other's futures. I hope you find what you're looking for, James. I hope you become the person you're trying to be. He shook her hand, but his grip was firm without trying to hold on too long. I hope so too. Goodbye, Rebecca. Goodbye, she said, but she meant it. Not as a see you later, but as a true ending, a door closing on a chapter that had needed this final scene to be complete. After he left, Rebecca stood in the conference room for several minutes, but she was processing what had just happened, testing her emotional response, checking whether his apology had reopened old wounds or provided the closure she'd claimed she didn't need, but apparently had needed after all. She felt lighter, but not because his validation had given her anything she didn't already have, rather because it had confirmed what she'd learned over the past 5 years, that she'd been right about what had happened between them, that her perceptions hadn't been distorted by insecurity or oversensitivity, that she'd been treated poorly, and her decision to leave, or rather to let him leave and then transform his leaving into her liberation, had been the right choice. Her phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. How did it go? Rebecca smiled, but she typed back, exactly how it needed to. Thank you for letting me know he was here. The elevator ride back to the 60th floor felt different than the ride down, but Rebecca understood why. She'd descended carrying the last remnants of uncertainty about whether James had ever truly understood what he'd done, whether he'd learned anything, whether his cruelty had been intentional or simply oblivious. But she was ascending with answers that, while they didn't change the past, somehow settled it more firmly into place. When she reached her office, Howard Chen was waiting with a folder, but his expression was excited. Ms. Morrison, I have the final approval documents for the London expansion of the foundation. The board has allocated $150 million for the project, and we've identified 3 properties that would be perfect for conversion into transitional housing. If you approve, we can begin renovations next month. Rebecca took the folder, but she also looked at the photographs on her walls. 47 countries worth of property, 5 years worth of foundation work, countless lives changed not by money alone, but by the strategic, purposeful application of resources to create real, lasting impact. But she also looked at the newest photograph added just last week, herself at a congressional hearing on affordable housing, testifying about innovative approaches to using private sector resources to address public needs. "Approved," she said, but she signed the documents with the confident flourish of someone who'd learned that power wasn't about dominating others, it was about lifting them up. Let's change some lives in London. That evening, Rebecca returned to the brownstone, but she found herself in her grandmother's study. She still thought of it as her grandmother's, even though she'd made it her own with modern technology and updated furniture. But some spaces held the echo of the people who'd shaped them. She opened the bottom drawer of the desk, the one where she kept her grandmother's letters, but she pulled out the final letter, the one she'd read hundreds of times, but that still moved her. "You are stronger than you know, Rebecca." She'd known it intellectually for 5 years, but tonight, after facing James and feeling nothing but compassion for the wounded man he'd become while maintaining firm boundaries around her own peace, she understood it in a deeper way. Strength wasn't fixed or finite. It grew when tested, expanded when challenged, deepened when shared, but it also required tending, protecting, honoring. Her grandmother had given her an empire, but the real inheritance had been the lesson encoded in every acquisition, every strategic decision, every patient year of preparation, that women didn't need to choose between power and compassion, between success and integrity, between strength and kindness, but they did need to believe they deserved all of those things simultaneously. Rebecca opened her laptop, but she began typing an email to the Foundation's board of directors. "I'd like to propose a new initiative for next year. In addition to our transitional housing and job training programs, I want to create a mentorship component where women who've successfully rebuilt their lives can guide others through the process. My grandmother taught me that the strongest legacies aren't built by individuals. They're built by communities of people lifting each other up. Let's discuss at next month's meeting." She hit send, but then she closed her laptop and walked to the window, looking out over the Manhattan skyline that had witnessed her transformation from invisible wife to visible force, from dismissed woman to woman who could no longer be dismissed, from someone defined by others' perceptions to someone who'd claimed her own definition. But she also knew that the journey wasn't over, it was simply evolving. The divorce papers that had trembled in her hands 5 years ago were filed away in storage now, but they'd stopped being symbols of failure or betrayal somewhere along the way, becoming instead receipts for the price of her freedom, documentation of the moment she'd stopped shrinking to fit into spaces that were too small for her, proof that sometimes the worst thing that could happen was also the catalyst for the best thing that could happen, but only if you chose to transform pain into purpose. Rebecca's phone buzzed one final time that evening, but it was a message from the London office. "First family has been approved for housing placement. Single mother, 2 children, leaving domestic violence situation." She said reading about the foundation online gave her hope that she could start over. "Thank you for building this." Rebecca read the message twice, but tears fell freely now. Tears of gratitude for her grandmother's foresight. Tears of grief for the woman she'd been who had believed she was nothing. Tears of joy for the woman she'd become who knew she was something. Tears of hope for all the women who would walk through foundation doors carrying the same trembling uncertainty she'd carried into that marble lobby 5 years ago, but who would walk out knowing what she now knew, that they were stronger than they knew, that they deserved better than they'd settled for, and that sometimes the ending of one story was just the beginning of another, better, truer story. But perhaps the most important thing Rebecca had learned was that going viral on YouTube with a dramatic revenge story would never have been as satisfying as the quiet, powerful, purposeful life she'd built instead. A life where her worth wasn't measured in views or validation, but in the lives she touched, the systems she changed, and the legacy she was building, one woman, one property, one strategic decision at a time. She picked up her grandmother's photograph from the desk, but she whispered to the smiling face, "Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself. Thank you for teaching me that strength isn't about never falling. It's about learning to fly after you do." And somewhere, Rebecca believed, Eleanor Ashworth was smiling, proud, not because her granddaughter had inherited billions, but because she'd inherited something far more valuable: the wisdom to use power with purpose, the courage to establish boundaries with grace, and the strength to build a life defined not by what had been done to her, but by what she chose to do with everything that came after. The lights of Manhattan glittered outside her window like possibilities waiting to be claimed, but Rebecca turned away from them and toward her desk, toward the work that would help the next woman and the next find their own strength, toward the future she was building with intention and purpose, toward the life she'd always deserved, but had finally claimed as her own. And that, she thought as she began reviewing the next day's schedule, was the real happily ever after. Not revenge served cold, but purpose served warm. Not power hoarded, but power shared. Not an ending designed for shock value, but a beginning built on the solid foundation of self-worth, strategic thinking, and the unshakable belief that she was, and had always been, stronger than she knew. The story wasn't about a woman who inherited $1 trillion and destroyed her ex-husband. It was about a woman who inherited $1 trillion and built something better than revenge. A life worth living, a legacy worth leaving, and most importantly, a sense of self that no one could ever take away again.